First World War. So if we're talking strictly about surface fleets, putting aside submarines for a moment, the Germans cannot easily match the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy's strategy in 1914 is relatively straightforward, and that is to enforce a distant blockade against Germany and the Central Powers. What is a distant blockade? A distant blockade is a naval blockade which aims to prevent trade between Germany and the Central Powers in this case and the outside world, other neutral countries around the world who are not involved in the war and otherwise may have traded with Germany and the Central Powers. So, for example, Germany needed to import chemicals from the Americas to support its agricultural industry and its munitions industry. The distant blockade is aiming to prevent this trade from reaching Germany by physically stopping merchant ships, neutral merchant ships, wherever they happen to be from reaching the ports of Germany and the Central Powers. Now, what is it about this blockade that makes it distant? Why do we call it a distant blockade? Well, the map on the right-hand side illustrates this very clearly. You can see that the main elements participating in the distant blockade, which are these little white circles with the black dots inside them, are really nowhere near the German coast. They're operating at quite a range from the German coast. And the blockade also includes a minefield, a sea minefield, which extends all the way from the northern tip of Scotland, underneath the Shetland Islands, over to the coast of Norway. So any ship that happens to make it through the blockade then has to navigate this minefield if it's going to get into the North Sea and ultimately reach the northern German ports, which are off of the map on the right-hand side. Essentially, the Royal Navy can afford to work at a distance here because it can effectively cover all of the sea lane approaches to the German ports without going anywhere near the German ports. And it's not desirable for the Royal Navy to go near the German ports directly because then they can be threatened by German coastal batteries, gun batteries, as well as small high-speed patrol vessels which could attack the large ships of the Royal Navy in the darkness, or even submarines which may operate at short range out of the German ports. So basically, I think of the Royal Navy as the boxer with the longer reach who can stay well back from the opponent and incur minimal possible risk. Now, in earlier centuries, it may have been more realistic to enforce what we would call a close blockade against an enemy nation in an instance where one wanted to interrupt trade. But the technological context in earlier centuries is entirely different than what we have in the first part of the 20th century, and the distant blockade is a relatively effective blockade, and one which minimizes the risk of interference from German coastal batteries, patrol vessels, so on and so forth. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to argue that over the course of the war, the distant blockade has an increasingly incapacitating effect on the war economies of Germany and the Central Powers because less and less material is getting through the blockade and reaching the ports of Germany and the Central Powers. Now, how is the German Navy going to approach its own maritime strategy in 1914 and 1915? And what the Germans intend on doing initially is to adopt their own naval strategy aimed at interrupting the trade of the British and the other allies. Now, because of the simple geographic facts of the matter, it's not possible for the Germans to enforce a physical blockade around the British Isles or the French coast that would look something like the British distant blockade of Germany, because this would bring the German High Seas Fleet into direct conflict or contact with the Royal Navy, and that's a risk the Germans are not really willing to take in 1914. And to make sort of an elementary analogy here, think of the German High Seas Fleet as a very expensive car that you save up all of your money to buy, but you're then afraid to take out of the garage for fear that the paint will get scratched. So you never drive it. One asks, what's the point in owning the car in the first place? And this is the same question that one could ask why the Germans bothered to build such an expensive surface fleet if they weren't going to bring it out of the North Sea and try to engage directly with the Royal Navy. Right? It's a fair question. So what the Germans are going to do instead is to send out small parties of surface vessels. We're not talking about submarines yet. We're talking about surface vessels, maybe of the size of a cruiser. Not the large battleships, but intermediate-sized surface vessels, and they're going to send them out all over the oceans of the world and try to interrupt commerce that is aimed at reaching the British or other allies. So this is known as commerce raiding. You try to attack lone merchant vessels that may be delivering any type of goods that are aimed um, at the Allied war effort. Right? And at this stage of the game, there isn't really seen to be a great deal of applicability of submarines as commerce raiders, because the submarines that exist in the fleets of 1914 are not really suited for wide-ranging activity, such as the international surface commerce raiding that the Germans are entertaining. Submarines are seen by many naval officers in 1914 as more of a novelty or a toy that may be used for local fleet protection or patrols around enemy coastlines and that kind of thing. It's not the submarine generally at this time is not seen as a weapon that has a far-reaching strategic potential. Not really seen as a weapon that has a far-reaching strategic potential. This perspective begins to change, at least as far as the Germans are concerned, by early to mid-1915. And the reason for this change is that while the Royal Navy blockade is generally effective against Germany, the German strategy of using surface vessels for commerce raiding is gradually breaking down because these surface vessels are being hunted down by Royal Naval ships and sunk or captured. They're vulnerable. They're not well protected when it comes to engagements against enemy naval vessels. They're only really intended to attack neutral or enemy merchant vessels, commercial vessels. Right? So the surface strategy toward commerce raiding is generally speaking a failure for Germany at a relatively early stage of the war. So then the question comes up of whether or not Germany's modest fleet of submarines could somehow take the place of the surface commerce raiders, which have largely been neutralized by the Royal Navy and by the Royal Navy's allies. And while, for the time being at least, these submarines cannot venture very far out into the blue waters of the Atlantic Ocean, or the Indian Ocean, or the Pacific Ocean for that matter, they could at least operate in the waters around the British Isles without being easily detected. Because there's really no way in 1914 or 1915 for a submarine to be detected electronically, like with radar, which doesn't exist yet, or sonar, which also doesn't exist. So unless a submarine happens to be spotted on the surface, it's effectively invisible uh, to um, to whoever it's trying to pursue. So with a very small fleet of just 20 operational submarines, the German High Command decides to undertake a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1915. And this is known as the 6 Weeks Campaign because the idea is that within just 6 weeks, these submarines allegedly could do so much damage to commercial shipping around the British Isles that it could actually bring an end to the war. Now, in practice, the campaign did not even come close to bringing an end to the war. And it didn't last 6 weeks. It went well into 1915, from February until about August. So it lasted more like 6 months. But nevertheless, it was an important turning point um, in strategic terms, in technological terms, and also with respect to total war. Because what the unrestricted submarine campaign does is give German submarine commanders carte blanche to attack any ship that they come into contact with that they suspect of carrying munitions or other supplies of a military nature to the Allies in Europe. It doesn't matter if there are civilians on board. It doesn't matter if it's a commercial ship. It doesn't matter if it's a neutral vessel. All of that's irrelevant. They're allowed to attack. And this invariably is going to become a major source of friction between the German government and the rest of the neutral world, particularly Washington, because remember, the Americans are not yet involved in the war, because invariably German submarines are going to end up sinking vessels which are either American property or have Americans on board. And one of the major crises that resulted, the diplomatic crises that resulted, came in the spring of 1915 when the Germans sank the liner Lusitania, which was a passenger liner. And that, among the fatalities that it caused, killed over 100 U.S. civilians who were traveling on the passenger liner. Now, the Germans argued that the Lusitania was in fact carrying war material, but nevertheless, it played very badly for Germany in the international press that a submarine would attack a commercial liner without warning. And this is where the rub really comes for the Germans in their campaign. Because while the submarines, despite their limited numbers, are reasonably effective, they cause all kinds of diplomatic problems from a legalistic standpoint. Because according to the conventions of maritime warfare, as they were understood at this time, in 1915 or 1914 for that matter, it was permissible for a naval vessel to stop and even search or seize an enemy or a neutral commercial vessel as long as the naval vessel, which was doing the stopping and seizing and searching, guaranteed the safety of the crew or the passengers on the vessel that was the subject of the search or seizure or attack. So, for example, if the Royal Navy stops a commercial vessel from a neutral country that is loaded with war material for Germany in 1915, theoretically it can sink that ship and follow international legal conventions as long as it guarantees the safety of the crew, which it could do by bringing the crew on board or putting the crew into lifeboats, etc., etc. Right? Submarines cannot comply with these legal conventions because a submarine, by virtue of its technological design, relies on the element of surprise and speed in its attacks. When it surfaces and attacks a commercial vessel, it has to do it quickly, either using torpedoes or small guns mounted on the submarine's deck, and then get away just as quickly because it doesn't want to draw the attention of enemy naval vessels. If a submarine comes head to head with a cruiser or a frigate from the Royal Navy, it's going to lose.